According to the New York Times, President Trump on Saturday posted on social media a single sentence that appears to encapsulate his attitude as he tests the nation's legal and constitutional boundaries in the process of upending the federal government and punishing his perceived enemies. Quote, he who saves his country does not violate any law, Mr. Trump wrote first on his social media platform, Truth Social, and then again on the website X. By late afternoon, Mr. Trump had pinned the statement to the top of his Truth Social feed, making it clear it was not a passing thought, but one he wanted the people to absorb. The official White House account on X posted his message in the evening. The quote is a variation of one sometimes attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte, although its origin is unclear. Nonetheless, the sentiment is familiar. Mr. Trump, through his words and actions, has repeatedly suggested that surviving two assassination attempts is evidence that he has divine backing to enforce his will. And even the conservative National Review called it an indefensible proclamation. What Trump has declared is indeed antithetical to a Republican form of government per se. As John Adams, our second president, once wrote, quote, a republic is the best form of government, a government of laws, not arbitrary rule. The very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. What Trump has said yesterday doesn't necessarily make him immoral or obscene. In the long course of history, there have, after all, been good and just kings. But what Trump has declared is most certainly un-Republican and therefore un-American. There is no legitimate argument otherwise. To defend it is the road to serfdom. When the Republicans say it's Nazi o'clock, God damn it, it's time to woke up.
The following moments may contain explicit language. Viewer discretion is advised.
According to The Guardian, Volodymyr Zelensky has had some tough weeks in the past 3 years, but this past one may be up there with the worst of them. Back on Monday, in an interview with The Guardian, the Ukrainian president was cautiously optimistic. He said he had received positive signals from the Americans over upcoming negotiations. Zelensky's main message: if Ukraine was to be denied NATO membership, it at least required NATO-style guarantees that would deter Vladimir Putin from coming back to bite off more chunks of the country in a year or 5. By Wednesday, the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had ruled out both NATO membership for Ukraine and any U.S. role in enforcing a peace deal. Later that day, in a surprise announcement, Trump said he'd conducted a 90-minute phone call with Putin and gave a press conference afterwards, during which he proceeded to rip up 3 years of U.S. rhetoric on supporting Ukraine. Trump said it had been a bad war to get into for Ukraine, suggesting it was Kyiv's choice to be invaded. He declined to say that Ukraine would be an equal partner in future negotiations, disparaged Zelensky's poll ratings, and repeatedly emphasized that his priority was regaining the money the U.S. had spent on aid to Ukraine over the past few years, bandying around figures that appeared to have been plucked from thin air. Perhaps the Trump comment that caused the most anger in Ukraine was the casual remark in a television interview that, quote, they may be Russian someday, they might not be Russian someday, but we're going to have all this money in there, and I said I want it back. It was a flippant dismissal of Ukraine's existential fight to defend itself from Russian occupation, wrapped up in a demand for cash. The pitch worked, and on Wednesday, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent arrived in Kyiv with a draft agreement on natural resources. But reports of the content suggest it requires Ukraine to hand over 50% of its mineral wealth without being provided any security guarantees in return. Zelensky has so far declined to sign. For some officials from the other allied nations, many of whom have become deeply personally invested in Ukraine's fight to throw off Russian domination, the crumbling of U.S. support over the last week has felt like a betrayal. This year's Munich Security Conference exposed the chasm in core values separating the Trump cabal from most Europeans and sparked deep alarm at U.S. efforts to control the Ukraine peace process and exclude European governments from it. According to French news service Le Monde, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance had declared ideological war on Europe. At worst, his relative silence on the topic that Europe most wanted to hear him on, Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine, prolongs the incomprehension and confusion over Trump's initiative aimed at ending the war. A thick fog now surrounds Washington's intentions between the public statements of Vance and the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and various interviews followed by denials, contradictory positions have multiplied. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Secretary Advisor Mike Waltz, and Special Envoy to the Middle East Steve Witkoff are planning to head to Saudi Arabia to initiate negotiations towards peace between Russia and Ukraine. Two sources familiar with the matter told NBC News. Kyiv has not been invited to the talks between the U.S. and Russia aimed at ending the war in Ukraine, a senior Ukrainian government source has told the BBC. The U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, had said Kyiv would be involved in Monday's talks in Saudi Arabia, but the source said no delegation would be present. European leaders have also not been asked to join the discussions and are due to meet instead on Monday in Paris at a summit hastily arranged by the French president as fears grow the continent is being locked out of the negotiations. During a speech at the security conference Saturday, Zelensky said Ukraine must be involved with any negotiations to end the war. Quote, Ukraine will never accept deals made behind our backs. No decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine. No decisions about Europe without Europe, unquote. An aide close to Zelensky said that as of Saturday evening, Ukraine has still not been invited to the peace talks between the U.S. and Russia. Quote, it is dangerous to speak with enemies before you speak with allies, the aide added. Ukraine's position remains unchanged. We need to have a joint position of Ukraine, the U.S., and Europe before any negotiations with Putin. Former UK Prime Minister John Major, who rarely offers a direct opinion on contemporary politics, used an interview with BBC Radio to call Trump's cabal unlike anything he'd seen in the past, and to warn that Washington might live to regret ceding the world stage to a more autocratic power. He also condemned J.D. Vance as hypocritical and not statesmanlike for lecturing Europe on free speech while cuddling Vladimir Putin's Russia. So this is the part where we send little Marco the water boy to certify Putin's wish list before we vilify Zelensky for not signing it. Their fascism is so predictable because their goal is always the evilest possible outcome every single fucking time. This right here is why the election broke me. I had to isolate and play Hitman for 2 fucking months because I couldn't stomach the fact that you fucking morons voted to surrender to the Russians. And next time you want to prove me right, let's not do it the hard way, if there ever is a next time. According to The Guardian, the world's richest man, Elon Musk, has vowed to oversee a radical hollowing out of government agencies, asserting this week that some should be deleted entirely as he defunds public programs and lays off federal workers like someone elected him. While the immense cuts are framed as a means of removing waste and fraud, they may also become a boon to private companies, including Musk's own businesses, surprise, surprise, that the government increasingly relies on for many of its key initiatives. Musk and his allies in the Department of Government Efficiency, the unofficial committee acting as the operation arms of his cost-cutting efforts, have targeted a range of major government departments. They have moved to close the United States Agency for International Development, slashed the Department of Education, and taken over the General Services Administration that controls federal IT structures. Doge staffers have also gained access to the Treasury Department, as well as setting their sights on the Department of Defense, Energy Department, Environmental Protection Agency, and at least a dozen others. While Doge begins to make deep cuts throughout the government, Musk and those acting on his behalf have called for implementing new artificial intelligence systems in federal agencies and completely overhauling American weapons programs. As humanitarian aid groups reel from Musk's cuts, tech and defense firms are seeing a chance to integrate themselves deeper into the new Trump cabal's agenda. Half of the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention's Epidemic Intelligence Service officers were among the cuts made Friday by the Trump cabal. In all, around 1,270 are being let go from the CDC out of 2,800 probationary workers. The cuts amount to about 10% of the CDC staff. It's unclear who decided which CDC staff to cut. While managers at the Atlanta-based agency were asked to rank probationary hires earlier this month, officials told CBS News that the final decisions on which staff to cut were handed down from Trump cabal appointees outside the agency. Many more CDC workers who had been hired as contractors were also cut by Friday evening, suggesting the toll on the agency stretches far beyond only probationary staff. Some teams at the CDC are made up in large part by contractors. Terminated for convenience was the reason given to one CDC contractor now out of a job. National Nuclear Security Administration officials on Friday attempted to notify some employees who had been let go the day before that they are now due to be reinstated, but they struggled to find them because they didn't have their new contact information. In an email sent to employees at NNSA and obtained by NBC News, officials wrote, quote, "The termination letters for some NNSA probationary employees are being rescinded, but we do not have a good way to get in touch with those personnel." The individuals the letter refers to had been fired on Thursday and lost access to their federal government email accounts. NNSA, which is within the Department of Energy and oversees the nation's nuclear stockpile, cannot reach these employees directly and is now asking recipients of the email to please work with your supervisors to send this information to people's personal contact emails. President Donald Trump's cabal has acted with unprecedented speed and in some cases questionable legality in seeking to cut large portions of the federal government, laying off staff and ending contracts. But that speed has resulted in complications, including firing people agencies actually want to keep. The termination notices, which read effective today, came within hours of a Russian drone striking the Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine. NNSA tracks nuclear risks in Ukraine, including through sensor systems. The NNSA saga comes as the Trump cabal executed mass firings throughout the federal government this week, primarily slashing the jobs of employees categorized as probationary. And let's not lose sight of the fact that this existential quest to find waste and fraud in our government is being done by the most incompetent, wasteful frauds this country has to offer. After wasting $4 million to attend last week's Super Bowl, today the president had to go to the Daytona 500. Now, he could have gone to the NBA All-Star Game, which also happens today, but I bet you're wondering why President Trump would choose a NASCAR race instead. I think, it's just my opinion, I think it's probably because the very fine people on both sides never chanted "fuck Joe Biden" at a basketball game. According to the New York Times, President Vladimir Putin of Russia shocked the audience at the annual security conference in Munich in 2007 by demanding the rollback of domineering American influence and a new balance of power in Europe more suitable to Moscow. Nearly 2 decades later, during the very same conference, top officials from President Trump's cabinet made one thing clear: Mr. Putin has found an American cabal that might help realize his dream. Comments by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Vice President J.D. Vance raised fears among attendees that under the new cabal, the U.S. might align with Russia and either assail Europe or abandon it altogether. The presence of American troops has been the underpinning of 80 years of peace in Western Europe since the end of World War II. But in a speech in Warsaw on Friday, before his arrival at the conference, Mr. Hegseth warned European leaders that they shouldn't assume that the U.S. would be there forever. Later in the day, at the Munich conference, Mr. Vance delivered an even scarier message for many European attendees. The enemy he sees isn't Russia or China, but Europe itself. Mr. Vance said about attacking European nations for using what he called undemocratic methods to restrain far-right parties, and that in some cases have been backed by Russia. He argued that the continent needed to recognize the desires of its voters, stop attempting to moderate disinformation in undemocratic ways, and instead allow such parties to thrive as the will of the people. If you're running in fear of your voters, there is nothing America can do for you, Mr. Vance said. Nor, for the matter, is there anything you can do for the American people who elected me and elected President Trump. And it always comes down to the art of the steal. Everything is transactional. If you wish to benefit in any way from the vast superpower that is America, you're going to have to pay. And Trump wants reimbursement for aid we already provided to Ukraine because he wants retribution for his first impeachment when he withheld congressionally approved aid to Ukraine because Zelensky refused to help him start the original Hunter Biden hoax. It was illegal, it was wrong, and the Republican Senate capitulated with his corruption and let him get away with it. Then he sicked a treasonous coup on the Capitol, officially became a traitor, got impeached a second time, and the Republican Senate capitulated with his corruption and let him get away with it. All because Mitch McConnell said he was already out of office and could still be held accountable by the criminal justice system. Well, how'd that work out? 77 million other traitors reelected a goddamn 34-time felon rapist, and he got away with it, and much, much more. So fuck this, I'm out. If you speak the truth, you're always right. Peace.